You are listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network.
Welcome to Scuderia F1, the podcast that's always up to speed with the latest Formula One news. Follow us on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Now, here are your hosts, Mark Daly and Kevin Laramie.
Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the show. Mark Daly here with Kevin Laramie. And Kevin, F1 is back this weekend. It is the Russian Grand Prix at Sochi, but there are a ton of different sort of non-F1 things to talk about right off of the bat. In Fernando Alonso, it's basically the entire last 3 or 4 days has all been about Fernando going to race at the Indy 500.
Getting to perfect his English and speaking in American English with people from Honda, from Andretti, from McLaren. At McLaren Indy on Twitter, you can actually follow Fernando's journey through to America. Actually, he's back in Russia right now, but he'll be back in America the next few weeks many times. He got fitted. Pictures were taken. The livery of the car was shown. The colors, it's a throwback to the 70s McLaren color. We were all expecting it, that kind of papaya orange. But what I was feeling, like, it's all good. We'll talk about what it's going to bring to McLaren, to Alonso, and to Honda in a second. But I have to address the sporting element here, like the sporting reason. It's one of the most gruesome races in the entire world. Never mind doing 500 laps, just 500 miles, 250 laps. Never mind just doing 1 or 2. It's one of the toughest ovals. It's a weird angles. It's there's old pavement. There's the Brickyard small section. It used to be a lot more. That's why I think named the Brickyard. But it's not an easy track to do your first oval race at. To get to qualify, to get that car there, to have yes, you're surrounded correctly with one of the best team. And Honda actually has a good engine in that series, which is not the case in F1. But I kind of have worried for Fernando it's hyped a lot and it has all the looks of a big flop.
It does, doesn't it? I mean, it's great, and you can kind of understand why McLaren is doing it, and it's obviously to maybe give something a little bit back to Alonso from a team that has pretty much under-delivered on a pretty large scale since he joined them a couple of years ago. And obviously, he's still one of the best drivers in Formula One, and obviously McLaren wants to keep him, but obviously their Formula One car isn't that great, and the Honda engine just doesn't deliver any power to really make him a contender, other than maybe hoping for a couple of points from a P8 or a P9 or a P10, if he can even finish the race. So you can understand from that point of view why they're doing it, and it's an opportunity to develop a little bit of good and positive press and some good news around the team. But like you say, I mean, the 500 it's a tough race. And I mean, you look at it and it's not really an oval. I mean, it's almost like a rectangle with some rounded corners, but
it's a 4-corner race.
Yeah.
There's 4 corners, and there's a blind one because I think it's corner number 3 if I'm mistaken, but there's kind of like 2 blind corners that it's when you get to racing in the pack, it's because there's that aspect to it too. It's not just an oval racing. It's oval racing, open wheel, but you do have the suction, aspiration, I forget the technical term right here, but the streamline, when you're actually drafting, there it is. When you're drafting, you actually need to draft and be behind and take over. It's a lot of different racing strategies, racing techniques that he might be aware of. He might have perfected them earlier in his career, but haven't used it in a long time being in F1. It's going to be interesting. It's almost an experiment. He wants to test himself at a different level for all those right reasons. Want to be remembered maybe as like the modern day Graham Hill. Fine. But I think maybe figuratively and even maybe literally, he's going to hit the wall at the end of May.
Well, you raised a very good point there. And yes, there's so many different aspects that are unique to that style of racing. And I mean, honestly, ever since the schism between Indy and IndyCar and Champ Car back in the mid 90s, I mean, that's what really kind of really killed my interest in that series was when they split apart, and they've come back, but it's never been quite the same for me. But I digress a little bit. But anyways, I mean, obviously,
it's never like in the same period. But
no, it hasn't.
That's something else.
I was just going to say, though, I mean, obviously Fernando is a phenomenally talented driver, but I mean, it's one thing for him to pick up on these skills and learn the theories and maybe practice them in the simulator and then get into the car and go through that prolonged testing period that they have basically that 1 month before they actually run the race on the last weekend in May. But it's going to be a different thing actually taking these theories and these different racing tactics and actually employing them in the race.
Not just that, Mark. Imagine you're another driver on IRL right now. You're a guy who's always racing day in, day out in that series, in the entire championship. And this guy is going to come in this weekend trying to win in front of me, trying to take those championship points away from me. I'm going to bump you just a little bit. Well, nobody's going to notice we're all in the pack and you end up in the wall. Everybody's going to be safe, but your race is going to be over. Those tactics have been seen quite often in races like the Brickyard. And I am not necessarily convinced that it's going to be easy for him. You have to make your place in those type of races. It's a war of attrition too, that the best way for me to describe those type of races, Mark, it's a sprint that is long as a marathon, where every corner can be dangerous, but you need to be alive at the end of each corner to finish the race first, but never mind performing. And then it starts to perform. And by the way, that's another thing that Fernando Alonso is not necessarily used to do, those length of races where the car changes, Mark. The car doesn't end up the same as it starts. With the use of a car for 200 laps and over 200 laps, the car evolves, changes, it becomes looser. You need to adjust during the race, and there's constant adjustment on those cars during those type of races, which is not necessarily the case to that level in F1. To that, the car doesn't get that beat up where you have to adjust the angles of the front wing, the back wing, the amount of pressure here and there, the tire pressure, to make sure that the car adjusts to the track temperature, to the amount of grips, because late there's more grip than earlier. So you can have more tire pressure without losing grip. So those little details that evolves throughout the race, though he's not necessarily used to explaining them as a driver and the feel of it to a brand new team who's going to be listening to him in the pit. So there's a lot of issues potentially just during the race if he gets to do it in Indy.
Well, it's so completely different, and as you were talking there, I was actually just pulling up the results from 2016, and Alexander Rossi, who won it last year, finished it in exactly 3 hours. And Formula One has the 2-hour time limit, which how often do we actually see that under normal circumstances? Not too often, unless
only when it's raining, and there's like a big accident and it gets delayed. Or Monaco, because it's Monaco.
Because Monaco, and that's the thing, and that is another interesting thing that Fernando said this week, was that the appeal to race and have a chance to win the Indy 500 is greater to him than the pull of racing at Monaco this year. And I thought to myself, wow, that is actually a pretty big statement, because
it's kind of boring and tough to race at Monaco, and the excitement of racing in an oval where the challenge is not the actual race itself.
It's true, but when you think about it, though, that Monaco is basically the jewel in the crown of Formula One, and it's where they get a chance to race in their own backyard, literally, because most of the drivers live there in the Principality of. So you can understand that maybe that it's. You can see the appeal to him, but I mean,
but he knows his car's not good enough.
Yeah.
So what's good finishing last in Monaco where you can't overtake and you're not going to qualify well? So what's the point? That's where I get where he might feel like, look, I might finish last, but at least I finished last doing something I haven't never done before, experiencing different things and just turning left for once.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to watch to see how far he actually makes it through the 500, because there are so many different things that can go wrong in that race and prevent you from even finishing, let alone from winning. And I mean, he's going to be going up against guys that are veterans, that are
Montoya.
Montoya
against Montoya.
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to be a tough thing. And of course, McLaren's even coming out, and Zach Brown, the new CEO, has been saying that this is a series that they'd love to do every year and they'd love to have a presence there. But Yeah, I mean, it's great to say all these things now, but let's come back and review that in about 5 weeks' time and see how it actually goes for them. Because, man, I totally agree with you. It's going to be so tough for them.
Mind though, right? If in the future McLaren decides to actually have a team, maybe,
yep,
in Indy, in IRL, I would kind of like that because it brings a certain constant, and you can imagine what Formula E is going to become right now, Mark. What it's slowly becoming, where every constructor is having his car slowly there, and Ferrari is going to probably move down the road to get eventually a Formula E car and stuff like that. That's going to be interesting to me because it's the same team, it has like a feel of sports where it's teams facing each other, and like instead of cities now, it'll be like Ferrari will have a Scuderia Ferrari in F1. We'll have a team in Formula E, and why not in Indy, racing in America, right? And it kind of makes sense branding-wise, kind of makes sense marketing-wise, kind of makes sense in a world where motorsport as a whole is struggling. There's some crown jewels, but as a whole is struggling and might need some streamlining, and having recognition of brands everywhere could help in a social media world to streamline and bring new fans and rejuvenate everything. Yeah, that might be a good idea, and might be interesting to see a McLaren team in Indy, a Ferrari team in Indy. I mean, the Ferrari one is utopic, I know, but maybe like us in F1 was utopia 10 years ago, and now it's actually happening. So maybe the other way around, a Peugeot or something like this starts a team in Indy, and it can actually make the constructor battle move to other series and just F1.
Well, the one thing that I can say about the whole McLaren and Alonso racing at the 500 this year is that it's got me more interested, I think, than I have been in a long time. And I'm old enough to remember how popular IndyCar was in like the late 80s and early 90s when I was a kid and growing up.
Up to the late 90s even. Up until 97, 98.
Yeah. Because
pretty much still when Greg Moore passed away, we're talking about off air, but
yep.
I think unfortunately the death of Greg Moore marked the end of the heyday of Indy racing, maybe in my memory.
Yeah, that certainly didn't help. I mean, Greg was a guy that came from my hometown, Maple Ridge, British Columbia, and I used to see him around in the off season. He used to go to the same gym that I used to go, and he was a very approachable, very down-to-earth guy, and it was really cool to see him there whenever he wasn't off racing. And his dad, he still may own the Maple Ridge Chrysler, which is kind of a cool thing. But there was that schism, that split when you had like the Indy Racing League and Champ Car when they split in the mid 90s, and I just kind of found it too hard to really follow both series, and it just didn't seem the same after that.
We're all saying to ourselves, why are those guys against each other? It's the same thing. It's like both Indy car, Champ car, open wheel racing at the highest level, call it what you want. Can't you agree? Why can't you have one of those guys there and those guys there? And here in Canada, especially in Quebec, we had a bigger affinity with Champ Car racing, having the Montreal Champ Car race, which I attended a few times and I had a blast.
Mm-hmm.
Until this year, I never had a chance to attend the F1 race. And that looks right now, Mark, almost guaranteed. Shout out to Samba Pete, and thanks for the opportunity to maybe be the last time I have. After this June, I might not be able to say that I've never seen F1 in person, if you know what I mean.
Yep.
So I'm excited for that. But I've seen Champ Car, and it was an amazing spectacle. And I always wondered, why not bring the good teams in Indy and the good teams in Champ Car and get rid of the bad teams and just create a super series or something? Like, why? Why not? It's
Yeah, and it like I say, it was great back in those days. Like, we were also talking about before we started recording here that how the Indy cars in the sort of like the early mid, like all the 1990s, maybe even a little bit beyond, they looked like militarized Formula One cars. I mean, they looked fantastic, and they had that sort of that unique sound to the engines, and it was a great time to watch them. I mean,
they looked fast, and they looked like they could take a beating and still run. Like they look tough. Right now, we look at F1, and basically the parts are shimmering and flailing, and one little thing's broken, and the car can't work anymore. Right? There's one thing that's fun about NASCAR, that I like to watch is they're bumping, they're drafting, they're roughing. The car's missing a door. It doesn't matter. They're still going after it. And that's kind of... Champ Car was kind of like the series in the middle of F1 and NASCAR, and that's why I kind of liked it. Then you had races like Mid-Ohio. Would never know what could happen, but yeah, I kind of miss it. Can you tell? I miss watching Patrick Carpentier fighting for the win with players, and Greg Moore as well with players in the mid-90s for Champ Car. That was awesome.
Well, you think about some of the names that were racing in that series at that time: Jacques Villeneuve, Paul Tracy, Patrick Carpentier.
Paul Tracy, the John Daly of...
Well, exactly. You had Mario Andretti, Emo was there, Michael Andretti, Al Unser Jr., Danny Sullivan, Bobby Rahal. I mean, there's so many household names. Yeah.
Oh, Newman Oz, Paul Newman, and his spaghetti sauce in the paddock. That was awesome to watch in the mid-90s too.
Yeah. We're getting very nostalgic here. So before we get too nostalgic, why don't we move on and start talking about some of the other Formula One news?
I just wanted to finish.
Oh, sure.
That's a transition with Honda, because now yesterday and today on Auto Week you can read about F1 and Liberty Media could move to boost Honda program, and right now they're not responding to rumors, but apparently there's already external sources working with Honda, maybe since the end of March, and maybe even the former F1 engine guru Mario Ilian is now maybe actually working with Honda. Nobody's declining to comment on it. Nobody's confirming it, but nobody's denying it either. And there seems like there's external sources giving a hand to Honda to boost their program. And Honda's Yusuke Asegawa said, "We are doing everything we can. We are using external sources and have been changing our organization since the beginning of March." So like we mentioned a few months ago when we were saying, and this is before they did the switch, Mark, maybe they actually listened to the show and got the idea from us. I doubt it, but maybe they do. We said, look, after a few years, if it can't work, maybe you call somebody that knows how to fix it and say, hey, how about you come here for a little while and look at what I'm doing? Maybe you can fix it.
Yeah, well, they had to do something because they say now that they figured out what the problem is with their MGU-H, and they may have some sort of patch or some sort of fix in place, because that was a problem that plagued both Alonso, allegedly, and Stoffel Van Dorn at Bahrain a couple of weeks ago. And it's just gotten to the point that it can't really get any worse. I mean, the engine isn't reliable, and it doesn't have any power to it. I mean, Alonso said that he's going through all the corners flat out, and it just doesn't have anything. And he's 30 kilometers an hour slower on the straights. I mean, I
can imagine Alonso in the car making movement with his backside, trying to go faster with the car. Say, come on, you piece of beef, go faster. But it's going to be interesting because in Sochi, Mark, even though it doesn't necessarily result in interesting races, there's part of that track that are really taxing on the car, and that flat out almost half circles. It's not a straightaway, but you're going flat out and still turning. So it's actually very tough for the car. And there's a lot of stop and start. 61% of the track is flat out, but you get 66 changing of speed in this lap track. And it's really taxing on the car. So for a power unit, this will be a test already for maybe the not newly designed, but maybe a little bit revamped McLaren Honda.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting, too, to see what happens in this one, because it's only been run twice before, and it's been run at different times of the year. The first time it was run in 2015. It was in the summer, wasn't it? And then last year they moved it.
Later. It was I think it was in the summer. It was almost mid-season, if not a little later in the season.
Yeah, and then last year they moved it back to, about this time this year, and both races
it was like the 4th or 5th Grand Prix,
yeah, pretty much the same time as it is on the schedule for this year, and we don't really know if anybody else is going to be able to win there, because the last 2 years
show, right? It's been the Lewis show twice and Triple Crown, which we dominated the entire weekend, not even close, and gets the win. Am I anticipating the same? Maybe, but maybe not, because you know what, Mark? It's been so close between Ferrari and McLaren and Mercedes. No, that's a lie. It's been so close between Hamilton and Vettel, because I think we have to make that nuance, because
yes, absolutely.
Raikkonen ain't close to Lewis, but Lewis and Sebastian, it's been really close. And the DRS problem that Hamilton and Mercedes have faced might be enough to maybe edge a few points here and there, and maybe we'll see Ferrari continue on the great streak, and maybe they can actually put 2 wins in a row this time and having success in Sochi.
Well, we did see that the Ferrari was better suited in the heat of the desert, and they said that they would expect to run good there. But now you get to where the temperatures are going to be a little bit cooler in Russia, so we'll see whether or not that suits the Mercedes more or the Ferrari. But it'll be interesting to see if we're going to see what we've seen over the last couple of races and see if it's going to go back and forth, or if one of them will be able to establish a little bit of a hierarchy now, or if it'll just be this continuation of this battle that we've seen through the first couple of races through the season, which honestly would be the best thing for Formula One, is this sort of continual battle, race in, race out. Is it going to be Vettel? Is it going to be Hamilton? And well, obviously it would be great to see one of the other drivers or other teams like Red Bull get in there, but that still remains to be seen.
I was going to say, what if we get a monkey in the wrench? What if this weekend is the weekend that out of nowhere Verstappen gets a win? Maybe because of race incidents that happened in the beginning. The first corner is pretty easy, but it's when you get to the second and third that it gets streaky at Sochi. And if something happens for who knows why, but there's a chance, maybe that's where the championship really gets interesting. And I've said a few weeks ago that I'm going to take a look at the championship, but not just the drivers, the constructors. And it's fascinating. Ferrari, 102. Mercedes 99. Both drivers of both teams will be needed to make points to get advantage in that Constructors' Championship, and that will be a fascinating battle throughout the season.
Absolutely, and that's an excellent point that you raised, because when we sit here and we talk about how great it is to watch Hamilton and Vettel going at it in the broader picture in the Constructors' Championship, that's where the battle gets really interesting. Is, okay, we know that these two guys can win races, but what's really happening with Bottas and what's happening with Raikkonen? We saw how Bottas really showed that he's starting to figure something out at Mercedes. I mean, obviously he put the car on pole for Bahrain, and then he had a little bit of bad luck at the start of the race when they couldn't deflate his tires to the proper pressure, and led to a bit of overheating. And then, of course, he just didn't have the pace in the race, but still he finished on the podium, which I think has to be the expectation if you're racing in a Mercedes, that you're going to be on one of those steps on Sunday afternoon. It doesn't matter if it's 1, 2, or 3. Obviously 1 or 2 is going to be better for them, but I think that's the minimum expectation. But also Raikkonen, I mean, I think out of those 4 drivers, out of Hamilton, Vettel, Bottas, and Kimi's the one that just hasn't delivered anything. And it seems like he's had some sort of reason or some sort of excuse through each one of the races so far that, his tires were overheating, or there's a problem with the engine, or lack of power, whatever it might be, but he's got to step up.
Seems like the team has protected him in their comments and the way they are assessing his performance. I have been open for a year now on the record saying that for the short term and middle term and even long term, when he's not going to be the man ushering the new designs, rules, and we're going to maybe finish with the show with the new rules for next year, or just the lack of change in some sort and the kibosh on others. If you're not going to go with Raikkonen in 2 years, do you want maybe somebody a little younger can step up right now, use the experience that he's going to win, because the guy next to, like Raikkonen, looking at Vettel getting the most out of the car, he's not necessarily learning a lot, and he's not going to carry that knowledge to better the car in the future. A young driver taking the place of Raikkonen, absorbing whatever he can out of Vettel, would actually carry that knowledge base forward and further. And that's why I believe a younger driver that's there for the foreseeable future, maybe a Bottas-like, maybe a Carlos Sainz or something similar to that, taking over for Raikkonen, even maybe in the next few races, could be beneficial for the long term for Ferrari.
That's great. I was thinking, just as you were talking there, well, who would be my list of drivers that would potentially fit that list? And well, obviously one young driver is Max Verstappen, but I don't think that Red Bull would want to part with his services. But then again, Ferrari basically has unlimited resources. And I think at the end of the day in Formula One, that's ultimately what decides things. Money talks, and if Ferrari wants to have Max Verstappen as a driver, very much as Mercedes wanted Valtteri Bottas as a driver for this year, they will find a way to get their most value from Ferrari, Red Bull that is, if they want to secure Max Verstappen as one of their drivers, should it happen. But Carlos Sainz, I think, is an excellent choice that you mentioned, and Sainz, I think, has proved at times that he has a lot of promise and a lot of talent. Obviously not with that move in Bahrain where he torpedoed Lance Stroll at the end of the pit exit there. And then
I hope he gets a race this weekend.
Well, I mean, 3 races and the poor guy hasn't even finished yet. I mean, brake failure in Australia.
If I'm Williams, I'm telling him, you know what, this weekend, take it easy. It doesn't matter if you start last. Start last, make it further, try to make it far in the race.
Yep.
If you have to finish last and then turn overtake later in the race, fine. But trying to at least survive this time. It's not that it's your fault, but at the end of the day, you're still responsible for your car. And if you have to finish last to finish, maybe you have to start there.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at the 3 ways that Stroll retired out of the races so far this year, brakes in Australia, then he had that coming together with Checo Perez at the Chinese Grand Prix, and that for me was like 50-50. I think that Perez was being a little bit wishful, trying to make a move on Stroll, but at the same time, Stroll left enough of a gap. He left the door open wide enough that Perez is going to think, hey, I've got an opportunity to get past him here. And unfortunately, I mean, he did get punted off of the track, and then he just ended up in that gravel and just sank down in the rocks, and he wasn't going to get out of that. And then again, this last race in Bahrain, he just was not aware that Sainz was coming out of the pit exit there. He would have passed him, but still, when he went around the apex of that corner, I don't think that he had any indication or any idea that Sainz was as close as he was. So, yeah, he's got to finish a race at some point, and whether or not that would be a name that Ferrari would even think of at this point, that's probably way too early to say. Another name that was mentioned at one point last year was Sergio Perez. He was linked to Ferrari, and he's backed by a very, very wealthy fellow. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's a telecom giant, another Mexican fellow, billionaire. So he's obviously got the resources and the sponsorship. Not that Ferrari necessarily needs the sponsorship money, but of course that would be a big added bonus. But definitely, I think guys like that, if Ferrari would want to look to a younger driver, then those would probably be the guys that you'd be thinking about.
Yeah, definitely. So that will be very interesting this weekend, is to see if Ferrari will continue, to see if Red Bull can come out of nowhere, and to see who else. Will Renault continue? Because Renault has shown some impressive speed here and there, and some race incidents, and Hülkenberg hasn't been really lucky during races. But I do feel Renault is due for a good result. Same for Haas. Haas, slowly but surely, their gamble they have taken last year in May, stopping any development for last season and focusing on this year for a small team, adjusting race day operation. There are more people in the paddocks for the team to handle everything, to handle the management and the logistic of the car and everything else. There's more hands, there's more bodies, there's more help. And it has shown, and slowly but surely, Haas is learning. Haas is having a consistent, solid, reliable car slowly. And they're going to maybe be, not always, but here and there, be a contender for points. And that could be interesting for some battles in the mid-table of F1, because that's where it's really getting crowded, and it's getting interesting because you have good cars against good cars now in the middle, and it's starting to get crowded.
Well, that's right. And I think that's one thing that we've seen so far with the new regulations that have come into effect for this year, is just how that's really affected the midfield battle. The battle at the front between Ferrari and Mercedes, that's maybe a little bit of a different situation where one is sort of caught up with the other and edged ahead to a certain extent, which you always kind of see. You always see one team sort of dominate at the front, then another team will figure it out and pass them. So is that happening right now? maybe a little bit too early to say, but definitely what we can say with certainty is further back, and that midfield battle is really fascinating. And when you look at Williams Mercedes, they're fifth in the Constructors' Championship at the moment with only 16 points, 1 point behind Force India, and Toro Rosso has 12. I mean, yeah, of course, it's early days yet in the championship, but if Stroll can get his act together and start finishing some races and hopefully finish in the points, they'll move up the standings. And then also Massa, he was quite disappointing the way that he really fell back at the Grand Prix in Bahrain a couple of weeks ago. And then you see Red Bull, who's kind of stuck in the middle there. They're not good enough to really challenge, and
they're way above everybody else, but they're way behind Ferrari and Mercedes.
Yeah, exactly.
There's no man's plan.
Yeah, they're sort of that buffer between Ferrari, Mercedes, and everybody else. So
Red Bull's the buffer.
Well, I think that even Ricciardo admitted this week that the RB13 isn't quite as good as they thought it was or hoping it was. So who knows how that car will develop and evolve over the course of the season.
That's what it was last year too, though. If you go back to the beginning of the season, when Danny Kvyat was actually driving for Red Bull, it wasn't the car that it was at the end. It wasn't the car that was challenging for wins or close to it or just maybe half a second behind Mercedes at the end of the year. No, it took the entire season of evolution, of upgrades, of getting to know the car, getting to how to get the most out of the car, getting to know how to adjust and tune the car to get the most output. And that took a while. And Red Bull is that car again this year, is that type, is where sometimes when you have new regulation, new type of car, you change it so much that all your data, all the knowledge you had doesn't necessarily work, and you have to get to know the car, get to know how to adjust it correctly. And they're going to learn that week to week, and having the resources and the abilities to learn quickly with their factory and all. They're going to get results faster than other teams. So you will see Red Bull getting closer to Mercedes and Ferrari in the next few months. But yeah, they're still the buffer for now.
Unless it rains, then you have to figure that Max Verstappen is going to pass everybody, which he literally did in China a couple of weeks ago, which was that was outstanding. What was it again? 16 cars that he passed on the opening lap? It was something insane like that.
Something like that, yeah. From I think it was something like that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely outstanding, amazing stuff. But there's also been some technical developments. We've been talking about the new regulations for this year, but it's come out that the strategy group met this week, and they've decided to crack down on T-wings and shark fins and just enforce the car limits at the rear of the car. And I think this is a good thing, because I know that performance is everything. No more gimmicky parts.
Yeah, no more parts that make no sense and just look like TV antennas and that flaps in the wind. And no more cars that seem like they're flat when you're looking at it from sideways with the shark fins. That's going to be gone next year.
Yeah, and that's a great thing, because I don't like them. I think it actually, from an aesthetic point of view, I think it really takes a lot away from how nice these new cars look. And obviously performance is a lot of these things for Formula One. If you're an engineer and the guy sitting on the pit wall and maybe the guy that's driving it, but it just, from a spectacle point of view, it just doesn't look very nice to look at.
No, it doesn't look like a proper car, right? But what's going to be, you remember that kind of, not the halo, because the halo has been kiboshed too, but remember that part where it looked like a flip-flop, a sandal on the top? That got kiboshed at the idea too, for the way to protect the drivers going in the future. And it seems like, if you remember, Red Bull had a kind of like a plexiglass or glass shield in front, that kind of windshield, but the idea proposed now for maybe 2019 or 2020, depending on the timetable, is a more elongated version of it, where from maybe a little past half the muzzle of the top of the car, the nozzle, you will have like a shield starting to finish at the top of the driver's head, so he would see through it, but it would protect him from incoming parts as well.
Yeah, and I like this idea a lot more than the Halo, which I think Lewis Hamilton said at the time was something, was like the worst modification or worst design thing that Formula One's ever seen, something like that.
Want to drive a Le Mans car, but don't make F1 look like Le Mans cars.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm all for giving drivers proper protection, and I mean, there is obviously an element of risk driving in a sport like Formula One, but make it as safe as you possibly can for the guys. But I just did not like that, like you say, that sandal halo thing. But when I saw the concept that Red Bull came out with, that aero screen, I thought immediately, okay, this is promise. That first one I saw, the halo, is like, no, just get rid of that. That is just absolutely horrible. But when I saw the way that Red Bull had designed it, and the way they had it on the car, I'm like, sure, it doesn't look that great, but it's a lot better than what that Halo concept was like. I thought, well, if they can come up with some sort of version of this aero screen, then this is a lot more promising.
Take example, a Le Mans dome, right? When you think about a Le Mans prototype car, Mark, you see in your head that kind of dome of plexiglass, right? Or whatever.
Yep.
Take the first part of that, make it like in front and look at half, and the car can look kind of cool with it. So it looks like kind of like in the futuristic, there's kind of like half a dome on it, but you still get to see the driver. I think it could be looking very nice because you kind of like have a kind of like speed racer type of like, right? Where you have like a dome of glass halfway in the front and in the back, but a little more elongated and look more like speed and aerodynamic. But I think for protection and for aesthetics, it might be the best choice.
Yeah, definitely. And there was also another interesting thing that came out from these strategy group meetings this week, that they're planning on an engine oil burn clampdown, and that they're monitoring the composition in oil, and that teams may be using it to burn it and to get like a performance advantage, basically. Yep. So
especially during qualification.
Yes.
Because the oil, well, no, the gasoline, the fuel will burn at a certain rate. And if you add some oil that happens to be there in the burning chamber by some reason, in the combustion chamber, it happens to be there. And if you happen to, because let's not forget, the fuel is injected in a kind of like a whirlwind inside the combustion chamber to get the most out of it and to get the least amount of fuel burned for the most amount of power, right? The least amount of fuel for the bigger power. And if you had some oil that appears to be there just at the same time, and it makes that combustion even more efficient, even more bigger power, and gives you more output of the same amount of fuel, it's kind of an unfair advantage.
It is. And there was a query that was sent from Red Bull to the FIA about the possibility of teams doing this in qualifying. And it's interesting that whenever these things get brought up, there's always that hint that perhaps this is something that Mercedes has already been doing. There's been other things that the teams have sought clarification for. And you don't always hear obviously what's going on behind the scenes in Formula One, but every once in a while you hear little things like that makes it kind of interesting to, or you get a little look inside. And it always seems that whenever there's maybe a bit of a shady or a bit of a questionable gray area, it's always Mercedes's name that gets brought up.
It's not that it's shady or gray, but Mark, when you design a car, right, especially at this level where the design are confidential because you don't want the other teams to get the same performance advantage, and when you have a team that's totally outperforming everybody else, they've figured out something that nobody else had.
Brawn and the double diffuser, right?
Yeah, and they want to keep that secret the longest possible. Because as long as it's secret, as long as they retain the people who work there and figured it out, as long as they retain those people and that secret, then they're going to dominate until the rule change. So we're going to figure out later in the next few years when engineers will start to go working somewhere else and those type of things, and their confidentiality agreement will be finished. We'll figure it out. We'll finally know why Mercedes were so dominant over the last few years. Maybe, like you mentioned, maybe it's the fuel thing and the oil. Maybe it's that. It's not that it's illegal, but it's something they have figured out that it doesn't say that you're allowed to. But it's not saying that you're not. It's just not written anywhere because it's something nobody thought of, and you figured out somewhere to get more horsepower out of it, let's just say. Those are all speculation, but that's what we'll figure out. And usually in F1 history, the Renault, Williams, all those teams, when they were at their peak and dominating over all the other teams, it's because technology speaking, they had found at least one thing that nobody else had and made their car a lot better. And the longer they kept that secret, the longer they dominated.
Yeah, and that's sometimes the difference between funding and innovation and design. When you put all those different elements together, then yeah, you do have an advantage over other teams. And sometimes it's just that tiny little fraction that makes the difference. Because I mean, let's face it, those Formula One cars, they're all fast. It's just that some are faster than others, and if you can pick up a tenth of a second here or a tenth of a second there, then all of a sudden that's adding up to half a second advantage over the course of a lap and over the length of a Grand Prix. I mean, that's a big difference.
Yeah, but if you're looking at the eye test, like from this to this, that's a difference between Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull in one lap. This is nothing. So that's over 3 kilometers, usually 4 kilometers. So that's nothing. We're talking about a few seconds.
That's all. That's all it really takes.
Right? So that's literally makes they're still fast. The Haas is still fast, even though it's not Ferrari. It's still pretty damn fast.
It is. So before we wrap things up tonight, Kevin, let's shall we make some predictions for this weekend? I think we can say for certainty that Nico Rosberg won't win again this year at the Russian Grand Prix.
Yes. That's for sure.
Which is quite interesting, because if you go back to this time last year, that was the 4th race in a row that he won in 2016. And at this point, after the Russian Grand Prix last year, he had that 43-point lead over Lewis Hamilton. And if you just listen to Lewis after that Grand Prix, how, I wouldn't say despondent, but just really how dejected and just almost despondent to a certain degree that he felt like the championship was slipping away, and just to sort of think how the sport ebbs and flows, and how he caught up to him and sort of really challenged him in that second half of the season. When you think that how big that gap was at the beginning of the year, and he brought it down to only 5 points at the end in Abu Dhabi in November, I mean, there was a lot that happened over the course of that season. It's quite amazing when you think about how that season shook out.
Oh, the ebb and flows of that season, and because of penalties. And you know how awesome that season would have been if you were allowed to change engine and change parts as you please, just to make sure your car was performant. How amazing last year's season would have been, even on top of it. That would have been awesome.
Yep.
Because Lewis would have been competing a lot more, and it would have been amazing. But because of the rules and because of the penalties and all, it was a close championship that Nico Rosberg won at the end of the year. But no, it was a fascinating season last year.
Could you imagine, though, if Lewis didn't have his engine blow up in Malaysia, how that would have really flipped that last 4 or 5 races of the year completely on its head? He would have had the advantage going in, and Nico, rather than just pushing his car and racing as hard as he had to over those last 4 or 5 races where he didn't necessarily have to win, as long as he finished second and or no lower than third, that would have completely changed everything. I mean, obviously now we have the benefit of time to look back and reflect on that season, but it really would have made a huge difference. So one thing I can predict with certainty for this season is that Sebastian Vettel will be looking in his mirrors for Danny Kvyat, but he probably won't get too close to him in qualifying, but you never know. He could have a good qualifying lap at Sochi, but that was probably the standout moment from last year, is when Kvyat plowed into the back of Sebastian Vettel, and then the first of several profanity-laced radio rants that we heard throughout the year from Sebastian.
Yeah, exactly. One of my predictions for this week is, will Lance Stroll finish a Grand Prix? I don't know, but I won't commit to say if he's going to finish or not. But I'll say it'll be at least the closest he has been to finish it. How about that?
That sounds fair to me. And I'm gonna go out on a bit of a limb.
More probable.
Pardon me?
That seems more probable than him finishing. Him at least getting the closest he has come in 3 Grand Prix to finish 1 Grand Prix.
You're taking a realistic approach, and I like it. I'm going to take I don't know if it's a less realistic approach, but I'm going to make a bold prediction and make the statement that Sebastian Vettel's going to win this weekend, and just how that would really make the Drivers' Championship just completely fascinating. You just know that Mercedes hates it whenever Ferrari's winning, and I think that it would really set up the storyline moving forward, going to Spain in a couple of weeks, just that much more interesting.
Toto Wolff will be banging on his desk once again.
I've got a GIF of that that I tweeted out. That's a classic. That one's staying in my library, and I'll be retweeting that one from time to time. But
they're so used to winning that I almost feel like they're entitled to. And be like, how dare they? How dare they win? It's our position. We're supposed to be there. We have the best car.
Yep, definitely. That is the almost the default setting for Mercedes now. I mean, when you think that they won close to 60 Grand Prix over the last couple of years and 3 world championships for drivers and the constructors, I mean, they pretty much figure they own the sport now.
It feels good. Thank you, Ferrari.
Thank you, Ferrari. If Red Bull could get their act together, that would just make it all that much.
How about like another one, like Red Bull, and how about like, I don't know, Toro Rosso, Force India, they're not that far. Sainz and Perez, actually, and Felipe Massa. Get your act together. Get some competition. This is fun when there's competition. Oh, when I saw races this year and I saw overtaking and I saw some great, you can tell the drivers like their car better because it has more power in the wider tire. You can tell because they're trying stuff, they're moving in and out, they're like dodging, and even though they might not be pulling the triggers on the move, it's just not a procession of cars, and that's a big improvement.
It is. And one team that we should probably also keep an eye on is Williams, as Paddy Lowe establishes his own stamp on the team. I guess you could say that the longer he's there and they get things sorted out. And he said that there's in some areas that Williams is actually ahead of Mercedes. So that will be one team to watch for sure. I think that maybe that we have, well, obviously we haven't seen what they're capable of yet, especially what with Stroll not managing to finish, and a couple of below par performances and finishes from Felipe Massa. So we'll see what happens with them as they get it sorted out. But I don't know about you, but I think that's about all I've got for this week. How about yourself? Anything else we got to discuss?
No, that's about it. I'm going to get ready for this. I'm going to start to get ready for Formula E. It's going to come back in a few weeks, I believe. And this summer, the last race of the season will be in Montreal. And I'll be geared up for the race in a month's time, Indy 500 with Alonso. But until next time, Mark, you can follow me on Twitter at Kev Laramie. You can follow the network at SportsPodNet. And on everywhere, the URL, sportspodcastingnetwork.com, you can find all the on-demand version of all the shows we do.
Excellent. Well, great. Thank you very much, Kevin. And also you can follow this show on Twitter at Scuderia F1 Pod. And that's it. That's a wrap. We'll catch you guys in a couple of days when we discuss what happens at Sochi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll catch you again soon.
Thanks for listening to the Scuderia F1 podcast. If you want to get the show notes for this episode, then head over to ScuderiaF1pod.com. Want to get in touch with us? Then email us at ScuderiaF1pod@gmail.com.
You were listening to SPN, the Sports Podcasting Network. Visit us, sportspodcastingnetwork.com.